There were fireworks in the Sunshine State, where the outlook's not so sunny for Democrats, it seems. The governor's fight is tight, but the Senate polls are leaning strongly to Republican Marco Rubio in a three-way race. And both GOP contenders have the backing of Tea Parties. As goes Florida, so goes the nation. The Democrats certainly hope not, but here to give us some perspective from Pensacola, Florida, our GRITtv Gulf Coast correspondent and prosecutor Mike Papantonio, host of Ring of Fire, joins me next.
You have spent this campaign ever since the beginning making up numbers.
That's not true.
Just like you made up Medicare fraud in your company.
Alex, you have, look, you want to talk about fraud? Let's talk about your job at Nations Bank. Your tellers were paid kickbacks. Your tellers in your bank were paid kickbacks for directing elderly consumers from safe, let's smile about it. You don't care about seniors? Is that the deal?
Is it my opportunity to respond? Good. I'd be glad to. You can't lecture me about fraud.
It was the governor's debate Monday night, and the Senate debate wasn't any prettier. Here's a glimpse of that one.
Why not release the full IRS records, the full credit card statements from what you charge
these
from
questions have been answered now since February. Yeah, my tax returns are public. I've gone well beyond the point of disclosure. The bottom line is people want to focus on these issues because they're wrong on the important issues. This country has a $13.5 trillion debt.
He doesn't want to release them because he doesn't believe in transparency. I created the Office of Open Government in the governor's office for the first time in the history of our state.
I've never had a heckler at the debate. I've always had him in the audience.
No.
What I'd like to...
It's the way it is.
Well, what I'd like to do is
Welcome to the NFL.
Welcome to the NFL. Mike, this is the kind of stuff that makes you long for hanging chads.
Well, the problem that we have in Florida is we have an elderly population, and believe it or not, there is a generational war going on between what I call the teabagger group and generation between 18 and 35-year-olds. So right now, they're able to overlook things like the fact that Rick Scott, that his company that he ran was hit for a $1.7 billion fraud, that he had to raise his right hand, Laura, 73 times and plead the Fifth Amendment. He had to say 73 times, pleading the Fifth Amendment, that he couldn't answer the question because if he did, he was afraid he was going to be criminally prosecuted. But in Florida, you have such an elderly population. The teabag movement is so strong because of that generational divide. Here's what I mean by that. You have a population here that doesn't want, they don't care whether Social Security disappears because they've already been paid their Social Security. They don't want to pay taxes for things like education because they've raised their children. They have their education. They don't really care about things like the infrastructure here in Florida, that our bridges are crumbling, our roads are crumbling, because they've already used all those things, and now all they care about is moving on and to hell with the next generation. So that's the divide that we have in the state of Florida. Look, Rick Scott, for all practical purposes, I was a prosecutor long enough to know a criminal when I see a criminal. It's incredible that this guy is even in the race. He spent $60 million of his own money to get where he is right now. And truthfully, you have a population here in Florida that's willing to overlook it because he talks about things like cutting taxes for education. He talks things about things like phasing out Social Security for the 18 to 35-year-olds because these old wangers have already gotten all their money, so they're going to move on now.
But I don't get it. I don't get it, Mike. I mean, it used to be that Democrats would say if we can just get out the senior citizen vote, those are the folks who remember the New Deal. They're the folks who remember the programs that came with the good Democrat agenda. That used to be a voting bloc that was seen as leaning Democratic.
Different old folks right now, Laura. Now the old folks I'm talking about are the old baby boomers, the people who said that social change was important in this country one time, the people who like to brag about the fact that they brought us civil rights. They didn't bring us civil rights. A small handful of them brought us civil rights. The people who say that they brought us women's rights, they didn't bring us women's rights. A small part of that baby boomer group gave us those rights. But now we have those old baby boomers getting older, and they could care less about the generational divide. That's why a guy like Rubio and a guy like Scott is an attractive candidate. They don't care that for Rubio example, they don't care that Rubio refused to put forward his receipts on his credit card because we were onto the idea that he was spending them for his personal use. Things like putting floors in his home, putting carpeting in his home, taking trips that nobody knows where in the hell he went, and he won't give us the receipts to tell us what that is. But that's okay with this aging population. It's okay with the teabaggers because they are single-minded. If you look at who makes up the teabaggers, it is not 18 to 35-year-olds. It is old fuddy-duddy baby boomers who are getting so damn old that they don't really care about what happens to the next generation. That's what's happening in Florida right now.
In the courts and on TV, Mike, you're often talking about the power of corporations. Corporations do everything they can, like any defendant, I guess, to try to influence the opinion of people, whether it's a jury pool or, in this case, the voting public. How is all of the money being spent this election in Florida playing out, do you think, for Floridians and for the state?
Yeah, let me tell you how it's playing out, Laura. First of all, we don't even know where the money is coming from. We do know this. We know that more than almost half a dozen organizations have completely proven the fact that most of the big money is coming from foreign countries like Russia, in China, in Libya. Why is that happening? Because they're supporting candidates. China, for example, supports a candidate who's willing to send jobs overseas because they like to be able to pay low wages. And they want those jobs in China. Saudi Arabia, why do they send money to the American Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to be distributed among our candidates? Because Saudi Arabia wants this oil dependence to go on. So they spend money on people like Rubio, and they spend money on people like Rick Scott because these people don't want change. And so you have a Saudi prince dictating the politics in the United States. It's not an election, Laura. It's an auction. And we're seeing that at ground zero right here in the state of Florida. Much of that money is coming in. $300 million. Right now, $300 million has been raised by people we don't even know who the hell they are. They say they're corporations, but you have corporations like Exxon going to their Saudi Arabian buddies over in Saudi Arabia, taking Saudi Arabian money, putting it in American elections, and affecting democracy in this state as well as the rest of the country. And you know, it continues to get worse as we speak.
I got to ask you about BP for just a minute. I'd love to know whether their money is showing up in that election, but also about the story that appeared in the Times-Picayune this weekend. They showed pictures of what looked a whole lot to me like oil in the Gulf of Mexico. The Coast Guard came out and said, it's just algae. What do you make of it?
Yeah, well, that's what the Coast Guard's done from the very beginning of this. They have become completely the lapdogs of BP. Obama was so anxious to make this thing go away, to get it off the front page, that he was willing to have the Coast Guard actually become complicit with BP. He was actually willing to have government agencies be the spokespeople for BP. It is inseparable right now, Laura. That's why the Coast Guard says, this isn't oil. Well, I can tell you, it is oil. The people we represent have gone out and looked. They've tested it. We know that it's oil. But the audacity of the Coast Guard to stand in front of a camera on behalf of this administration, that's who they're speaking for, and say this is not a problem. We know it's a problem. We know that 80% of the oil that was spilled on this coast is still in the Gulf. But you have an administration that is so locked and loaded with corporate America, BP specifically here, that they're willing to get in front of a camera and lie about the truth of what happened on this Gulf.
Sounds like the FEC, the Elections Commission, is kind of like the Coast Guard of our elections. Any final thoughts, Mike, for those who are wondering whether just to give up on this process at this point? We've just got about 10 more seconds.
There's no reason to give up. The early Democrat progressive vote is looking very good. Continue going to the polls. In Florida, it might not help, but it's going to help in the rest of this country. I'll call this race. Alex Sink is going to win in Florida because maybe those old fuddy-duddies will at least understand they can accept a criminal, but he can't be a criminal as bad as Rick Scott.
Mike Papantonio, co-host of Ring of Fire. There's a link at our website, GRITtv.org. Much more to come.